Deacon Nicholas Kotar, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks, Austin.
I've been really looking forward to this. Today, we're going to be talking about great stories, fiction, how all of that relates, as well as fairy tales. And I thought maybe we could start with this question of what do the fairy tales that a culture tells show us about that culture? So, what do fairy tales reveal? And specifically, I know your background is in Russian fairy tales. So, maybe what do the Russian fairy tales reveal about a certain Russian spirit of a given age?
It's a great question. I'm not going to speak generally about all fairy tales, but you can, I think, apply my answer to in some way, shape, or form to other cultures, as long as you're considering their history. The Russian, but the Russian case is rather unique. I think, and it could be just because I'm a Russian chauvinist, and I can't help it. But um, the argument that I've heard that's most convincing to me is that the best way to look at Russian fairy tales, especially the ones that seem to persist for the longest, the ones that are the oldest, and not surprisingly, those oldest ones tend to be the most popular ones, the ones that get transmitted in the most frequency with the least amount of variation in the different forms of it. Those seem to be a kind of distillation, if you will, of a long period of time when the Russian people, not the Russian elites, but the Russian people themselves transitioned from paganism to Christianity way back in the 10th, 11th centuries. And the process is an interesting one historically because as with some other European contexts, the Christianization primarily happens in the elite circles initially. There's an acceptance of the new faith that is that happens on the level of the princely family and their extended. Usually, since the Russian context, this would have been a warrior cultural context. So the extended warrior clans were the first to accept it, and the people themselves, as in the common people, the further they were removed from elite circles, the longer generally it took for Christianization to take in Russia, and the further away they were from the cities, the longer it would take. So much so that you would have pockets of straight, outright paganism up until the 13th, 14th centuries, especially in areas that were far away from cultural centers, large-ish cities. You can't really talk about large cities in Rus during this time because we are comparing sort of barbarians with centers of culture such as Rome and Constantinople, and you can't really compare them at that point because the comparison doesn't hold. But uh, still, whatever cities the Russians were able to build in the early centuries were still centers, more or less, of culture, and that culture became Christian very quickly. Uh, but the people themselves, although they were receptive to it, the form of paganism in Russia was unusual, even though it's a northern country and it has some similarities culturally, historically, with Scandinavian countries. The Scandinavian pantheon was a much stronger and more coherent religious system than anything the Russian pagans seem to have had. Although it's hard to tell because Russian paganism has been pretty much eradicated, and so all that we know about it is sort of post factum information that is filtered largely through Christian sources. So it's hard to say what Russian paganism actually looked like. But as far as we can tell, it didn't have a strong pantheon, and whatever pantheon it did have was largely imposed by elites that had actual Scandinavian family connections, which means that you would think that that would be easier to convert a populace that doesn't have a strong pantheon to worship, but actually it's harder because it's this kind of the image that comes to mind is the image that shows up in the movie Silence, um, where the apostate priest played by Liam Neeson talks about the soil of Japan being swampy and therefore unable to put down strong roots, which we can talk about that. I think it's a terrible image and I really don't like that movie, but that's an entirely different conversation, I think. But in Russia, the fact that the cultural substrate was kind of spongy in a lot of ways, which meant that there was no firm hold for any kind of concrete religious belief. It was all transactional for the most part. So you would have various spirits of the forest, of the house, of various aspects of your life that you would try to placate, as ancient pagan religions generally tended to function. But because of that, when you have the introduction of a new god, as it were, he's simply another form deity, etc., that might need to be placated. And the full cultural inculturation of Christianity into the life of the Russians took longer because of that. Because it was not that they didn't accept Christ, they did, but for a long time there was a parallel observance that on Sundays you would go to church, but at home you would still leave offerings to the small house deity to make sure that things didn't go wrong, and the stores for winter weren't rotted through, or you didn't have an infestation of vermin or diseases or things like this. So you would make sure to cover all your bases. That kind of slow movement away from a practical and a transactional paganism towards a more incarnational view of the world mediated by Christian culture took a long time for the people. And it took very quickly for Russia in general, but it took a while in terms of the popular culture itself. And you see that in the fairy tales, because the fairy tales are incredibly moral. Not that they're moralistic, but they have very strong moral centers. And yet they don't have any frequent appearances of priestly figures or Christian worship in particular. And yet the worldview that they exhibit is a very clearly, deeply Christian worldview. And yet you have totemic animals, you have talking animals, you have certain images, certain repeated tropes, the wise hag, the old man in the forest, that are clearly repeated patterns that you will see in various pagan folk cultures. And yet now they're playing a completely different role, where if you're not looking purely at the surface level of what the fairy tales are telling you, you can see that this is a very deep and very profound acceptance of a Christian worldview that is being expressed through a culture that has not fully rejected its natural forms of storytelling, and instead has baptized them, so that the explicit pagan associations that you would have had with these figures, with these characters, with these tropes, with these storytelling rhythms are left in the past, and they've become completely associated with a brand new way of seeing the world, a way of seeing the world that is filtered through the light of Christ, that is filled with an entirely different sense of what the divine is, not as something distant to be placated, but as something intrinsic for you to be transformed by. That's a long lecture. I'm sorry.
Not at all. That was wonderful. And it brings me to this really important question, I think, in these spaces, or at least a common question. I think it's important too, though. We sometimes use the phrase like a Christian book or a Christian movie or even like
Yes.
a Christian fairy tale. And I think in this context, it becomes really interesting to try to parse out that question, because it sounds like we have this kind of these pagan figures, maybe a pagan veneer, but it sounds like you're arguing for a more Christian worldview kind of motivating the story. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think of that title, like a Christian book or Christian fairy tale, and if it's one you'd use, would you describe these as that or something a bit more gray? Hey, I hope you're enjoying this interview. I wanted to take a moment to let you know some really exciting news. My debut novel, The Long Road to Holy Island, is currently available for pre-order. It's a story about a young man who loses his mom and decides to go on the pilgrimage she always dreamed of, even though he doesn't share her faith. It's a novel about grief, meaning, and making sense of faith in a world that so rarely makes sense. I may be biased, I am, but I really think you'll love it. If it sounds like something you'd enjoy, it would mean the world to me if you pre-ordered a copy. You see, buying copies early makes a really big difference, as it signals to the bookstores and book buyers that there's a demand for the book. I truly poured my heart into this book, and I hope it ends up touching your heart too. So if you want to grab a copy, you can do so using the link in the description.
It's a complicated question because these words that you're using have specific associations for different people in different ways. And whether you like it or not, the term Christian, outside of its historical context, as in the context of the cultural history of Christianity from the moment of Christ's resurrection, in the English language has a very particular association, whether we like it or not. And I'm specifically talking, especially when it refers to cultural norms. And I'm talking about the fact that for most Americans to this day, I think, as far as I can tell, when you're talking about the label Christian, for many people, for most people, it means specifically evangelical, and it means it means not Catholic. It means not any other, not Orthodox, not any other form of Christianity. And you yourself know that to this day, in a lot of places, in spite of the inroads that some of that the older forms of Christianity have made in the public consciousness, there are still plenty of people who would come up and ask an Orthodox person, "Are you Christian?" Um, because in their mind the association is specifically with evangelicalism, and that's just a fact. I'm not making a judgment call either way, but I'm saying it because in the public consciousness, beyond the consciousness purely of those who identify as Christian, the idea of Christian culture is firmly wedded still, and I think unfortunately, with a very particular subgenre of Christian fiction, Christian films, Christian TV, Christian music that is explicitly and exclusively evangelical in nature and very particular to a certain American subcultural context that is very young when it comes to the expressions of Christian cultures throughout the world from the first century, right? This is a very, very specific, very limited form, and yet most people in America will associate the word Christian, if you refer it to cultural context, to that specific and very limited thing. So I need to say that to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. I don't associate the word Christian culture with that kind of cultural expression. And I think more and more people are starting to realize that it's okay to say the word Christian when speaking about culture, stories, music, novels, and not mean the specific sub genre of when you walk into a Barnes and Noble store, you walk into the Christian section, and it's just stuff published in Tennessee from 1990 to 2015, right? Books like The Shack, etc. Right? Very very specific kind of expression. Since that is the expectation, then what I'm talking about when we're talking about Christian culture is something else. The fact is that throughout the transmission of Christianity, from the very first moment to the various forms of old world Christianity that now later on informed New World Christianity, the word of Christ has never been passed on outside of a specific cultural context, which means that there is not such a thing as spreading the gospel in a way that doesn't involve the artifacts of human culture. It simply doesn't happen. And we know that because there were problems in the early church between those who associated with themselves with the Jewish way of life and those who associated themselves with the Hellenic way of life. This is in the book of Acts. It's in the book of James, right? Those things are specific cultural aspects of Christianity that were present from the very beginning and they were never pulled out by the apostles themselves. The issues that were addressed by the apostles were not issues having to do with get rid of human culture. They were issues of do not let human culture become the most important thing. And yet, the human culture is never a thing that is explicitly talked down. But in modern context, very often, there's a kind of, especially American ones, there's a weird tendency to try to pass on the word in a way that is somehow pure and outside of the specifics and the limitations of human culture. Uh, Precisely because in a lot of Orthodox and Catholic contexts, the transmission of the faith has come specifically through ethnicities that are not Americans. And in the American context, this has led to anti-Catholic feeling in the history of America, et cetera, right? So there's this kind of thought that American Christianity should be something that's uniquely American and not touched by anything outside of the American experience, which is simply impossible and misunderstands the way that history actually works and the way cultural transmission actually works. So, getting back to the idea of Russian fairy tales and whether they are Christian or not, which I think is the point of your original question, even though I've gone very far afield here. The thing that I would answer is that these tales in particular are an expression of a world view that is deeply rooted in the lived experience of a people who have come to accept Christ in a very specific way. So the term Christian fairy tale in this sense doesn't really make sense because the fairy tale comes from a tradition that is inherently Christian. So you wouldn't apply that label necessarily because it qualifies something that's already intrinsic to the tales themselves. And the fact that we feel a need to say that, Christian fiction, Christian music, shows, I think, that the cultural forms that we are engaged in actually come from a worldview that's not Christian. And what we're trying to do is superimpose an artificial sense of Christianity on top of a form that comes inherently from a source that's not Christian. Now, that's not to say that fairy tales or novels or music do not come to us through the Christian inheritance of Western civilization. Of course, it does. But I think we're revealing our own disassociation from our traditions, from the source of our culture, when we superimpose these labels artificially. Because it should be enough just to say the novel, and for most of its history, that would have presupposed, or the Western novel, I would say, that would have presupposed an engagement with Christian culture and civilization that was inherent to the writer's own life. And that would come out in different ways, right? So you had certain authors that were Christian, certain authors that weren't, but there would always be a dialectic, a conversation inside the story that was rooted in a common and shared worldview. So when we're talking about Russian fairy tales, you would not, I don't think, say these are Christian fairy tales, purely because the very designation doesn't make any sense. However, there is such a thing as a Christian fairy tale. I would argue that the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen are explicitly Christian fairy tales. Why? Because they're not traditional fairy tales. Fairy tales are not authorial compositions, usually. They come from a long tradition of oral storytelling that goes back beyond the memory of the one who passes on the story. They come, as it were, from like the bones of a people. But some writers write original works that mimic the storytelling forms of fairy tales. In Hans Christian Andersen's specific case, he wrote stories that were intended as, uh, how would I say this, as exercises in a Christian morality for children that was able to remain not moralizing, which is a very hard thing to do. And that's why I think they're some of the best modern fairy tales that you can find. George MacDonald is another one that I would lump in there. I would say that they're Christian fairy tales because he's writing in a specific mode that is intended to awaken a certain kind of response, a response that is as theological as it is creative. I don't know if that answers your question. I went off in all kinds of directions there.
No, it does. There's so many different directions that I want to go off in now. I think I'll try to keep it where you were ending up there to avoid giving people whiplash. You made this distinction in your first answer as well, and I want to kind of hone in on it. The difference between a moral story and a moralistic story. That
Yeah.
might sound like a fine semantic difference, but if I'm tracking where you're
No.
going with this, it's a rather important one.
It's huge. They're not remotely the same. Moralistic in this sense is a story that where the moral of the story, as it were, is the primary reason for the story. That's moralistic. In other words, the story becomes a vehicle for a form of propaganda. And this is intentionally provocative because these stories, when written in this way, are written by parents or are told by parents for the express purpose of teaching their children some important truth that they want then to be transmitted. The problem is, as any parent will actually recognize, you don't teach children by telling them. I mean, you try; it doesn't generally doesn't work. You teach them by showing them, by demonstrating a virtuous life, and then if the things that you say correspond with the things that you do, they are more likely to stick. So, not surprisingly, the kinds of stories that don't tell a straight up moral, but rather suggest a morality through the rhythms and the tropes and the movements of the stories themselves, tend to be more interesting to everyone, but to kids especially. And there's some interesting scientific research that's done on this. Now, as a quick qualifier, I'm not somebody who generally starts a sentence with "studies show." I'm a storyteller, not a scientist. In general, if anybody uses the phrase "the science," I tend to do this and stop listening. But that's just a personal thing. However, I will note that sometimes there are certain scientific findings that simply reflect age-old truths, and I note them for those who are more likely to put credence in the science as opposed to long-standing received traditions, which is not me, but I'm open to the fact that some people need a more positivistic attitude towards demonstrated truth. So I will tell those kinds of people this is an interesting side note that there have been neuroscientific experiments done on children. That sounds much worse than it actually is. uh, the process itself is a bit opaque because the scientist, a man named Angus Fletcher, who wrote a book called Wonder Works, Wonder something, I forgot. And maybe if you find out what it is, you can put it in the show notes. But it's a very interesting book about the power of story to inform culture. He basically did an experiment where he tried out two forms of the same story, of the Cinderella story. One of the forms was the sort of now traditional Charles Perrault version, the 18th century Enlightenment version of it, which is extremely moralistic. It's all about good girl does good things, and good things happen to good girl because good girl does good things, as opposed to a different form of that tale, which recurs in a lot of different traditions, which is much more chaotic and much less about the goodness of the good deeds of the character, and much more about uh, a wild, unfettered kind of chaotic character navigating a strange world and having a certain reference point to the wildness of the world that then rebounds on him or her in a way that is positive, which is a much more accurate reflection of how children actually navigate the world. They don't think, usually, I need to do this, 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 and then I will receive that. They bump into things, and depending on how those things react to them, they learn whether or not what they did was right. Yeah. So that, not surprisingly, there was a way that they measured the attention of the children listening to both forms of the story, and by far the children did not react positively to the moralistic version of Cinderella and reacted much more positively to the other, more chaotic, more realistic, as it were, form of the story. So it's simply, this is a point that I make a lot, and I think it's important. People don't talk about it enough. Good literature is good not because we have decided that it is good or we have some sort of artificially imposed categories. You oftentimes hear this sort of thing in critical theory, where people basically say that these are, white, moral, colonialist, etc., forms that are being imposed on marginal um, populations. When in actual fact, most good stories in most traditions tend to follow similar patterns because they reflect actual reality, as in they reflect the way that human beings interact with each other in real life, meaning that there are certain patterns, certain inherent reasons for the way people interact, because the world itself is filled with inherent meaning. So the stories that reflect that actual reality of the way that the world is, as opposed to the way the world we prefer the world to be, tend to be the ones that resonate the most with readers and with listeners. And that's why the oldest forms of stories tend to be the most popular, because the oldest forms are the ones that are least changed by the trends and fads that are specific to historical time periods. So in the Russian fairy tale sense, whenever you have the appearance of a Russian Orthodox priest in a fairy tale, you should probably run, because it means it's a late story, because there wouldn't have been Russian Orthodox priests in fairy tale settings in the 11th, 12th century. It would be too weird for the people to tell stories about priests. They're still getting to know who they are. So they would have had, princes and bards and merchants and peasants, but not priests. The priests are a more recent introduction, where in the 19th century, for the most part, those fairy tales come from that kind of time period when the state church becomes associated in the people's consciousness with injustice and with kind of collusion with an authoritarian government. So you will have most priest characters in Russian fairy tales being quite negative. But those tales are very recent. So you should avoid them anyway, because they're not as good at reflecting real reality as the really old tales, which have things like shapeshifters and ancient crones living in huts on chicken feet in the forest, and various forest spirits and talking animals and things like this. Ironically, those stories are much more Christian, as it were, than the more recent ones that tend to retell story forms in the particular historical reality of 19th century peasant life, for example.
Yeah, and this is just top of mind right now for me because I'm doing my master's at St. John's College. I know you were in classical education. I don't know if you're familiar. Taking a seminar on or a preceptorial on Plato's Republic, and there's the famous
Hmm.
kind of idea of like we've got to censor all the storytellers, right? And
Especially the poets. Yeah.
yeah, especially all the poets. And it strikes you as like, we're just going to get rid of all the good parts of Homer, the parts that make it interesting, right? And it's the kind
Yep.
of thing that I think we see today, even, right? Of,
Yes.
okay, if I want to write a Christian story, how do I kind of sand off any rough edges? How do I make everything very black and white and very clear? I wonder at the
Yes.
same time what you make of maybe the opposite inclination that we'll see in some kind of modern storytelling where like everyone is morally gray and there's like no
Yeah.
sense of right or wrong. Do you think that is to err in the opposite direction, or do you think that captures the kind of chaos of human life? What do you make of those stories where it's like, I don't know what to do with any of you. I don't think
Well,
any of you are good.
most of those stories are actual fracturings or inversions of existing classical storytelling forms, which are told in intentionally to provoke a negative reaction. They're not intended to tell an eternal truth about the human condition. They're intended to provoke a response, a reaction. They are reactionary, revolutionary, depending on how you approach it. Both adjectives can fit. They're an intensely modern form and one that is only popular in certain time periods. And we're going through it. I think we're coming to an end of a cultural time period when such storytelling is popular. And I think over the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see something like the resurgence of, we're going to see a new Star Wars, not as in, uh, not in the sense that the new form of Star Wars is going to be as popular as the old ones, but there's going to be, I think there's going to be some kind of archetypal story form, some sort of new legend that is going to capture the imagination of people in the same way as people's imaginations were captured in the 1970s by the original Star Wars. I think the current Star Wars is basically a dead IP. Um, so getting back to your question though, there are certain time periods when people are not so much consoled by this sort of inverted and fractured storytelling, but are confirmed in their thinking that the world is inherently broken. And since stories tend to resonate and amplify our own realities, our own experiences in very deep ways, because they allow us to essentially inhabit other people, other beings, other selves in very deep ways. When you feel that kind of resonance and it reflects your own very strong intuitions about how the world is, whether or not it should be that way, then you tend to go towards that thing. So in a time period where the world seems broken and fractured, there is a tendency for a lot of people to tend towards those story forms that break archetypes, because it suggests then to the people that it's okay that the world is broken. This is just how it should be, and actually we've been lied to all this time. And there's a kind of short-lived consolation, anti-consolation. Tolkien would not have used that word, but yeah, that I'm using that word on purpose because he uses that word very intentionally in his essay on fairy stories, where he talks specifically about this. But it's a kind of short-lived consolation that doesn't have a resolution to it, so it will necessarily end in a kind of nihilistic darkness, which is why you see, despite the popularity of, say, something like the early seasons of Game of Thrones, you have almost universal dislike of the final season, which, whether or not it actually accords with George R. R. Martin's vision for the final book, which he will never write, um, is very much in line with his worldview, which is essentially a nihilistic and dark one. In other words, the ending cannot be a good ending because that would be contrary to just the way that he tells stories entirely. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't a place for an occasional inversion, because what I'm saying here is that sometimes you need to be awoken out of your state of passivity. And if the stories that have been told again and again and again become so familiar that you no longer see the beauties that they are trying to tell you, sometimes the forms have to be broken. But what you do at the end with that sense of being dislocated is really what will determine whether or not that story will persist for a long time. So you have Jonathan Pajot talks about this a lot. He talks about postmodern storytelling as a neo medieval paradigm, actually, where it does break some of the forms, but it does it in a way that can be reverential towards those forms in certain expressions. So he uses the example of the latest Spider-Man movie, where essentially all the different forms of Peter Parker come into. I didn't see the movie. I'm quoting him, so I could be wrong about this, but all the different forms of Peter Parker come together into a single universe, as it were, not for the sake of Easter egg hunting, as it were, but ultimately for the sake of redeeming the mistakes that each one of them makes. So you have this weird fractured version of Spider-Man where you have all these different forms co-inhabiting in the same place, which is a very non-traditional form of storytelling. And yet, by doing that, you're allowing each one of them to fix the mistakes that they made in their versions of Spider-Man. And as a result, they're bringing cosmos back into the chaos that the storytelling form itself is creating, which is really interesting. It's like there's a desire even in the storytelling forms that are fractured to go back to a form that is more reflective of a reality that is filled with the grandeur of God, with the meaning and the truth of a creator.
This is really interesting to me because it shows a certain tension, I think, that the storyteller faces. On the one hand, we have the notion of certain archetypes, certain patterns in stories that are
Yeah.
good to build on, and not just because they are things we've agreed upon, like you said, these aren't kind of impositions, but they actually reflect
Yeah.
reality in some deep way.
Yes.
But like many rules or like many patterns, sometimes there is something in playing with them or breaking them slightly in the context of a kind of more ordered world where we can notice that something's being broken and we feel
Yep.
something there. But it sounds like what you're saying is when we just break everything and keep breaking everything and we lose any sense of the pattern or structure, then we're left with nothing really to grab onto. It just becomes kind of it's like in philosophy or something where all you have is deconstruction. You've just got a bunch of
Yeah.
pieces now. There's nothing actually to
Yeah.
build anymore.
Exactly.
Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, and because of that, you're seeing something that anybody could have predicted, and that's that there is no defining or universally interesting cultural paradigm in the book world or in the music world or in the movie world. So any kind of storytelling forms in this particular moment are not uniting people in the way that stories tend to unite large populations of people at any given time. Right now, like never before, we're having this very strange manifestation of microculture where anybody can pick whatever tiny little subgenre of whatever they want, and they can just live in that tiny little micro universe that they've created for themselves. Whether it's something as absurdly niche and ridiculous as vampire Amish sci-fi romance, which actually exists. I've seen covers for this. Um, the point is that when you get to that point, the best you can do is to kind of huddle up with others like you and create a sense of community around a shared idea of something small. But that is inherently limited because it can't extend outside of its own limitations. While true, deeply rooted ancient archetypal stories, even in their modern forms, tend to unite people outside of specific limited interests. So what happened in the 1970s was that we were in a position in a cultural moment post Vietnam where there was a lot of this same kind of postmodern deconstructionist fragmentation on every level of society. I mean, not surprisingly, it's the 70s that saw the kind of flourishing of postmodern philosophy, especially of the French kind. It's right around that time, right? And in spite of that, or maybe because of that, the things that should have been popular, the things that should have been blockbusters, the things that should have attracted a lot of attention, things like The French Connection, these dark or Chinatown, these dark, gritty, noirish type thrillers that were very reflective of how people felt about the world, or even something like First Blood. It's very similar to this. Like First Blood's a very interesting movie, by the way. Has a lot of things to say. It's actually a very, very profound film. Um, Rocky 2 just destroys any of that. Not Rocky. You know what I mean. The sequel to it, Rambo 2, completely destroys anything to do with the first one. But again, another conversation for another time. And in this time of universal fragmentation, you have suddenly this weird, completely fairy tale space story with blasters and swords and knights and princesses, which everybody was making fun of, including its own stars. Alec Guinness did this kind of holding his nose because he needed the money. He ended up making a ton of money, by the way, because he took a percentage of royalties as opposed to a large salary. So whether or not he planned that, he was actually very intelligent. But suddenly there was this huge interest internationally for this weird little story, and people couldn't understand why. But if you panned out and thought more historically, it would make all the sense in the world. In a moment of universal fragmentation and tension, racial tension, social tension, problems economically, all this, the problems with the idea of the American dream. It was exactly an archetypal story that had nothing to do with reality, that just did a very good job in expressing the old forms of storytelling that have been passed on, like as I mentioned before, suddenly becomes this huge cultural juggernaut that extends its influence all the way to this day. Well, I think now we're seeing the end of Star Wars as a cultural force, but it's taken how many 50 or more years for it to get there. It's pretty remarkable. And that's my point, is that this power of stories is such that the right kind of story can unite people around a shared vision, not of story, but of the world. Because the story reflects the world as it is, not as we perceive it to be. Sometimes our perceptions of the world, because the world is so fallen and fractured, become very dim because we can't see the light, as it were, the light of Christ coming through the clouds. And the stories are like a wind that pushes away the clouds so that the light can come through and attract us to a different way of seeing the world, a vision of the world that is cosmic, in the sense that the world itself has inherent meaning because the world itself was created by a meaningful capital C creator.
I find it very hopeful, that picture of the fragmentation of the 70s, then followed on by a film and kind of a franchise that tapped into something just more basic, that eschewed some of the kind of like meaninglessness and said like let's actually just look at like what people kind of foundationally or just inherently are drawn toward. And as you mentioned, the kind of how we are today, or where we are today, in terms of we have a fragmented culture. I think in a lot of ways we don't have kind of shared stories, especially even just the nature of how we receive our stories. I mean, so much of it is through streaming, right? And
Yep.
even that is so fragmented. Like, oh, you guys are an Amazon Prime household, we're a Netflix one, or whatever. And it's like, or it's all
Yes, yes.
algorithmic, and it just shows like it's
Yes.
always so interesting going to someone else's house, and if they pull up Netflix, and it's like I've never seen any of these things on Netflix, but
Yeah,
like
it's
my
completely tailored to their specific needs. Yeah.
exactly. And so what I think what everyone must be watching because it's at the top of my Netflix is completely
Nope.
different than what someone else is thinking that everyone is watching. I had
Hmm.
this experience the other day when I'm not personally into reality TV, but someone brought up the show Traders, which I thought was like a big cultural thing. And the people I was with were like, what
It's
on earth
not.
is that? I was like, oh, because my family talks, or Eliza's family talks about it at family gatherings and stuff. And I was like, oh, this is so weird, so fragmented. Anyway, um, what that makes me think of is you spend a lot of time in the space of Christian writing, coaching writers, or I don't even know if I should say Christian writing, but I imagine a
Yeah.
lot of your writers know you also in the theological world and these things.
Yeah.
But how do you balance on the one hand, it can be exciting that like the fact that a channel like this exists and has almost 100,000 subscribers talking about such niche topics, like on the one hand, that's kind of cool. Like there's a niche for
It is.
everything. And no
Yep.
matter what you're into, like the internet will help you find other people that are into whatever, even if it's Amish vampire romances or
Yes.
whatever. But at the same time, if you're kind of coaching a writer or you're just thinking about this for yourself, how do you balance that? On the one hand, it's really exciting that I could just niche down so far and kind of be that person for a small, big fish, small pond versus,
Yeah.
yeah, but I also want to like unite people in a fragmented time and reach beyond that. How do you go about thinking
Yeah.
about that?
It's a very good question, and it's kind of uncovering the hood a little bit, and making me have to address practical realities as opposed to what I wish were the case. In my vision of a united culture, whether it's the West at large, or just the United States, or just Christians in America, or whatever, I decry and deplore this hyper nichification that you're talking about. But I use it entirely as the foundation of my successful author business because this is what the internet does. It allows for the amplification of all voices, as long as those voices are specific. And the more specific, the more it amplifies it for a certain subset of the internet audience, whatever that is, the massive group of people that use the internet, which is basically everybody. So on the one hand, it's a tragedy of our times that you don't have a kind of shared culture, even if it's a shared elite culture or a shared popular culture that you would have had in the old world in places like Russia, in places like Greece, in places like England, where you do have a deeply shared popular culture that transcends individual needs and desires and goes back centuries. Um, you don't have that anymore. On the other hand, you do have the ability, as you didn't have before the internet, to attract people to what you believe to be truly beautiful visions of the world, just on a smaller scale. So yes, this is something that I traffic in, as it were. So I'm not going to pretend like I'm some sort of idealist who wants to destroy this version of the internet, because it is the source of my independence and my financial freedom. I'll be upfront about that. But I will say this: there is a flip side to it. Although you can attract a certain number of people so that you can become successful as a creative, as a YouTuber, as a writer, as a whatever you want, really what people want, in spite of how they act, what they truly want is something that transcends that. And if that something that transcends becomes available, a lot more people go to it. And you have this happening every once in a while. You have small little upsurges of more general attention towards things that seem to be reaching towards something that breaks the hyper nichification of the internet. And sometimes it's things that you wouldn't think would be the case. Something like Squid Game, which is
Yeah.
bizarre that it became so popular. And its popularity didn't end up being as lasting as it could have, because it's not it doesn't quite transcend its own genre, but it's a very good example of a well executed genre. And nowadays, uh, because content is the thing that pushes attention, it doesn't necessarily force you to actually become a technician in a genre, whether that's in fiction, nonfiction, a certain kind of technology, the camera in YouTube, etc. Like, all these things have technique associated with them that if you were to actually master, it would mean, as long as your message was sufficiently interesting, that you would probably attract more people than the other guy who's not doing as good a technical job as you are. So something like Squid Game, or something even like Bridgerton. I don't want to talk about it without, I hate the whole that's a whole, again, another conversation for another time. But these things show the potential of things that start to reach towards a transcending beyond the limitations of genre, but don't quite get there. So you have a sudden little upsurge of attention for a short period of time that is more than simply that small group that tends to like those kinds of things. But it fades. Why? Because genre begs to be transcended. It begs to be more than it is, just as human beings want to be more than they are. This is our drive towards the divine. We all have it. We are not happy with simply being intelligent animals. We want to explore the divine that is in us, in the world, and out there that we reach towards. This is something that keeps showing up again and again in all cultural forms. So, technically speaking, that means that if at some point some writer, some filmmaker, some musician, some YouTuber, I don't know, were to come up with a thing that is perfectly within its genre, an ideal version of that thing, and yet also begins to incorporate elements of transcending that genre by maybe including elements from another genre. And I'm speaking technically, I'm not speaking specifically about things like sci-fi or fantasy. I'm talking about like a form, a cultural form, an artistic form of any kind. If we see something that transcends, and I think this is why Star Wars, again, to return to that old example, was successful on such a vast scale, because it was a fairy tale, but it was more. It was a fairy tale in space, which in the post space age time, when we stopped going to the moon, is exactly the sort of thing that's going to attract attention. But it's also firmly a fairy tale. But it's also a political commentary because there's a plucky group of rebels and an oppressive imperial regime, which you could extend any way you want. That could be the Soviet Union, it could be America, depending on how you're looking at it, right? So, but it's not any of those things individually. It takes all of those things and creates something that is itself. It is elements of all those things, but it is also something else. It is itself, and it is greater than the sum of its parts. When that happens, you sometimes have a breakthrough success that then becomes a classic, that then becomes something that you remember for centuries afterwards. And in our particular situation, where success is measured by how niche you are, this is very difficult to achieve, and it's not something that people can model well because it happens very, very rarely. But I think we're primed for some. I said this already, but I'm just going to repeat it. I think we're primed for some kind of story, whether it's visual, whether it's in book form, whether it's oral. I don't know. Maybe Martin Shaw's storytelling is going to become the greatest. Oral storytelling is going to become the greatest cultural event of the 21st century. Could happen. I don't know. But we're primed for something that is simultaneously rooted in the ancient, but conversant in the contemporary, but in ways that suggest a way of being that is simultaneously looking towards the future and looking towards the past and comfortable with the present. I don't know if that makes sense.
It certainly does. And I think it's a helpful and honest look at where we're at. Because on the one hand, it would be easy to solely lament the kind of nichification of the internet, but to recognize like there's also good things that have come out of this for both of us and for many people.
Yes.
And it's, I'm glad that I can find things I'm interested in and find like-minded people. At the same time, I do think there is something lost when we lose a shared culture and shared stories to come around. I think I mentioned this in a podcast I was just doing the other day. Like in some families, you have to like convert in order to marry into that family. For Eliza's family, like I had to get into Harry Potter. I'd never watched it, never read it, but like that was like their shared culture. And like between Christmas and New Year's, all the cousins get together and they watch the movies, and so it's like a form of enculturation into the family. But since then, like I mean, we're all like 20s, 30s now, and it's like there hasn't really been a follow-up for us of like what's next. And that's kind of, I think, the question of like what is next that's going to be that kind of cultural phenomenon in that way. And I want to lead from that into fantasy specifically, because you've published in this space. I love reading fantasy, haven't written any myself, but I think it's such a fascinating genre. It's having an interesting moment right now. It's blowing up, but it's shifted a lot.
It's not. It's not blowing up. There's a form of it that's blowing up, but it's not fantasy.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say. So it's shifted from these, like, it was probably, I think, safe to say, like a male-dominated genre of a certain way of telling stories, and it has shifted into a primarily female-dominated genre, author and reader, I would say, of like romantasy specifically. So if you go into Barnes and Noble, like it more than likely that's going to be front and center somewhere. Yep. And so I'd be curious your thoughts on what makes good fantasy, and maybe in this similar way of we've been talking about where you're hoping to see things go, what might you hope for the fantasy genre?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. There's a lot to be unpacked here, and I would recommend that you point to some other videos on YouTube that talk about this in interesting ways. I can't remember off the top of my head who it is, but there's a young woman that's been talking about post Lord of the Rings fantasy, and how it's not actually Tolkien. It's sort of an anti-Tolkien. American fantasy is a very interesting beast because it is almost entirely driven not by reader tastes or by cultural trends, but by publishers' desires for money making. The whole the whole Lord of the Rings phenomenon in America is essentially tainted on a certain level because it became popular through a paperback version of the Lord of the Rings that was pirated. So this was in the 60s, and Americans didn't know about Lord of the Rings. It had become quite popular in the UK and in other Anglo areas. In the US, the edition that became super popular was a pirated paperback version that did not pay any royalties to Tolkien directly. And what happened was that there were a few publishers that recognized that there was a cash cow here, but they recognized it purely as a generic reality, and I'll explain why that's important in a second. But they saw that there was a story structure form that Tolkien was tapping into, and they took the most basic form of it. And these are people like Lester Del Rey and some of the other of publishers like Tor, yeah, sort of the classic fantasy American publishers. They essentially recognize that there's a pattern that male readers will like. It's a simplistic version of the hero's journey that involves a male hero. It involves a wizard-like mentor. It involves a dark lord. It involves a kind of uh, small eucatastrophe. For those who don't know, this is a technical term that Tolkien uses that refers to the sudden, unexpected turn at the end of a fairy tale that is as mediated by the character's decisions as it is by a kind of uninvited divine help that comes in spite of the hero's personal actions, which in Tolkien is very important. Like, it's not Frodo that throws the ring into the he fails ultimately, and it's an act of providence, as it were, that causes Gollum to fall. It's accident, chance, which in a pre-Christian world is just another world for unexpected divine providence in a world that doesn't quite recognize or know the one true God. But the American version of fantasy post Tolkien didn't take the same mythic structure of the heroic quest, but instead did a very quick and dirty version of the hero's journey that was all about self fulfillment and about self actualization. So if you read a lot of those 70s, 80s, 90s fantasy classics, Tad Williams, etc., some of them are good, some of them are not, but they all tend to share the same kind of rhythm. And that rhythm is Tolkien-esque. It looks like Tolkien, but it's not the same genre. It's not myth, it's fantasy. So modern fantasy is not the same genre as The Lord of the Rings or Narnia or any of the classics of fantasy that we tend to talk about. Those books are, technically speaking, myth, as in the genre that they belong to. The actual beats of the story are not fantasy, they're myth. Fantasy is similar. It has a lot of the same kinds of beats, story beats, as myth does, but the central, the central character arc is related to a character's self-actualization, not the re. So myth has to do with seeking immortality. It has to do with the yearning after Eden. It has to do with restoring uh, cosmos to a world that is broken down. Fantasy is all about finding yourself and the power that is embedded in you in a different land. The classic fantasy is The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland. Those are both archetypal fantasies. They're much more interesting for a modern reader because they map out much more accurately to the way that we are taught that we need to interact with the world. That is, impose our meaning on it, as opposed to accord ourselves to the meaning that is inherent in the world because the world was created by a meaningful creator, which is the Christian way, right? So modern fantasy has slowly been going away from the mythic archetypal storytelling forms that are inherent in both myth and fairy tale, but in different ways, for a long time. What we're seeing now is simply the last gasp of the fantasy genre, as it were. And it is a death throw because romantasy is, in essence, for the most part, and I'm going to be pilloried for this and people are going to throw things at me, it's essentially pornography. And there is technical work done on this, neuroscientific work done on this, that clearly shows that if men tend to prefer visual stimulus porn, women tend to prefer pornography in print. The word smut is used as a positive in the world of romantasy. It's spice, it's used as a qualifier that has levels to it. Smuttiness, how much smuttiness is included in this book, and almost all of the societal taboos relating to reading pornography have been removed because it has gotten this kind of glossy sheen of a very respectable ancient form that it claims to belong to, fantasy being associated with fairy tales and with myth. This form of fantasy, not just because of the romantic element, but because of the direction that the genre has been taking over a long time, is essentially a fractured form. It is a broken form, and it's not going to go very far. The only thing that it's doing now is repeating the same format again and again and again, and not surprisingly, very soon, if things continue the way that they are, the kind of authors that are writing this sort of fiction are going to stop making money, because this sort of book is exactly the kind of thing that AI can do very quickly without any particular input from a human. And if all you want is a particular kind of emotional um interaction or emotional response, then you don't care if it's written by a human or if it's generated by a machine. And that's the direction that this sort of fiction is going in right now, and it's kind of scary, but it's also entirely natural. This is the direction of the machine, as Paul Kingsnorth would have it. So the fact that the machine's literature is not going to be written by a machine and enjoyed by people, enjoyed being very much in air quotes, is, I think, inevitable.
So, where do we go from here? I think is my follow up question to that. And in one sense, I think there's the answer of return to the myths, right?
Yep.
Um, and at the same time, something we noted at the beginning with folk tales or fairy tales and how they're communicated is that they're always birthed in a culture, right? That
Yes.
they don't
Yes.
kind of float up out of nowhere. And so I'm curious what you think. Well, maybe we can stick to fantasy specifically here. For the person who says like, I think it's easy to say, okay, I'm just going to write Tolkien 2.0, or easy to
Yep.
say, not to do. Um,
Yes.
or like, let's just keep writing new versions of the Iliad, like forever and
Yeah.
ever. Um,
Yeah.
but those were born in their own times and places. And so I
Yes.
think part of the challenge is to recognize the unchanging archetypes here, but also
Yeah.
to not just, I don't know, get in a time machine that isn't available. So as you think
Absolutely.
about fantasy, like how do you see that being done?
Well, it's a good question, and you've mentioned whether implicitly or on purpose, two things that I think are important. One is a return to old forms, not for the sake of nostalgia, but to recognize that the old forms contain something that is inherently resonant for people in any historical period, but then figure out ways, and this is a technical problem that requires technical skill, of transmuting those ancient forms, those ancient genres, in ways that are more interesting and acceptable and resonant, again, for people living now, not for some idealized human that we need to become. So don't write super esoteric, complicated, long sentenced fiction because you need to become the kind of person that can enjoy this. No, uh, condescend to people's levels in the best sense, but in a way that will help inspire them to raise themselves above the muck that they're imbibing almost passively, whether it's Sora AI or romantasy or any other form of distraction. Malcolm Guite was asked recently something similar about who's going to be the next Tolkien, and his answer was pessimistic. He suggested that it might not even be a book; it might be music, it might be some other form of culture, because the shared experience of reading stories in community is not happening at the moment. That being said, you mentioned that the cultural or community aspect is integral to any of the things that we talk about being classics or having extended influence over people throughout centuries as opposed to a few years. And I think that's true, that not only the effect of the story has to be beyond, has to influence people beyond your own generation, it has to influence people in the future as well. But it's not only that. I think the creation of it itself has to be done in community. And I think we've always created in community. And this is a very strange thing that now our existence is becoming more and more like individuals in a bubble that interface with reality through a digital interface. That's not normal. It's not natural. And that kind of reality is perfectly optimized by AI bots. So if you want to live that way, they're going to provide a perfect virtual world for you to inhabit. You don't need a human to do that. They're much better at it because this is their natural substrate. So much better than to seek others who are like you and learn from them and create with them. This is a project that I've been dedicating my life to for almost now 20 years. It's something that I felt very strongly about. As soon as I came out of college, it's something we did in community, storytelling in community in San Francisco when I lived there. And it's also what I do now. Most of my work is basically helping uh, others create a community, whether in small or hopefully eventually in a way that might be felt by the larger culture, by offering the experience of learning the story forms together and creating them together. I'm talking specifically about St. Basil Writers Workshop, which is a workshop that I run, and it's associated publishing on Wood Between Worlds Press, which are new small ventures that I'm not going to pretend like are going to take over the world or going to become the next Star Wars, but at least I'm trying to model the kind of approach, the kind of answer to the problems that I talk about and that you've expressed to me and that others are expressing to each other. How do we tell a story that is resonant with a lot of different people in a way that doesn't push them away? It is done probably best in a community of people who are able to tell stories to each other and to learn through that process of seeing the light in people's eyes come on whenever you do something right in your storytelling, then becomes a technical challenge to overcome that perhaps you extend outwards beyond that small group, beyond that local community, beyond that parish, beyond that. This is how things are done. This is how culture is built. You start on the particular, you start on the local, you start with your family, you move outward from there. And at some point, and this is where the creative act is not dependent only on you as an individual, at some point there is a moment where small c creator works with capital C creator, and the effect of the two working together is so full of glory that those around you cannot help but pay attention. And since attention is the currency of modern time, that is the best thing that we can offer others, is attention towards something that is truly beautiful, that is truly transcendent, that truly calls us out of our limited, fallen, dark, empty selves towards being filled with the good that we know exists both in ourselves a little bit, but much more outside of us in the Creator who made us.
Well, Deacon Nicholas, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I want to commend you for seeing a challenge out in the world and actually doing something about it, right? And saying, okay, we have this desire to create beautiful things, but it's not something we can do very well on our own. So let's change that. And I love people who have that ability not only to see a problem, but actually to go out and do something. So I appreciate you doing that. I want to commend you for that. And thank you again for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Austin. Sorry, I was bloviating there a little bit, but I appreciate the time.
No worries at all. I enjoyed it.